Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. Tonight, my guest is Ben Cowan. Ben is an environmental lawyer and a nature photographer, and those two worlds come together in a shared passion for wildlife and the natural landscapes that sustain it. Through his photography, Ben tells visual stories that invite us to slow down, look more closely, and appreciate the beauty of the natural world. Ben's photographs take us from the waters below the surface to expansive landscapes and remote wilderness areas around the world. You can see more of his work through his website, bencowanphoto.com. And if you're on Instagram, you'll find him at Fins Feathers Photos, and I'll link those in the show notes. But in tonight's presentation, Composing for Connection, Ben will talk about how creating an emotional connection elevates a photograph into something more meaningful. He'll share simple but powerful guidelines for composition in the field, and then walk us through how thoughtful post-processing can shape light, add depth, and draw the viewer into the scene. Along the way, we'll travel with him through images and stories from Alaska to Patagonia and a few places in between. Welcome back to the Happiness Hour, Ben.
Thanks so much, Linda. And
You
thank you
bet.
all for coming. I'm going to start my screen share here. See if I can
Ben,
get it.
if you want to, if I didn't fill in your bio enough, you're welcome to
Sure.
do that, or feel free to do that
Yeah, let's
if
go.
I missed something.
Have
Yeah,
we got is that showing
you're
up for
good.
everyone now?
It just came up. You're good.
Great. Okay. Well, hey, everyone. As Linda said, my day job is an environmental lawyer. I do environmental and wildlife law, largely in connection with renewable energy development. And that does give me a lot of opportunity to work on conservation projects and get out and about. I've been an avid environmentalist for most of my life. I actually started with photography back in the 80s with underwater photography, and spent quite a bit of time for about 15 years doing underwater photography until and selling some of my images in the early days of the internet. And then I had a family, and as tends to happen, put the camera down for a while, but picked it up again about 10 years or so ago. My focus shifted a little more to wildlife and landscape photography at that time. I still do underwater stuff, but it's a little harder to get to. I'm based here in Houston, and we have a lot of opportunities for bird photography here in Houston. But as I like to say, the best thing about living in Houston is how easy it is to get out of Houston. Nonstop flights everywhere to Alaska to Patagonia and parts between. So as Linda said, I like to get out on workshops, learn by doing, and I've been doing that for quite a while now with a few different photographers that I go with. But over the last several years, I've really sort of assimilated some of the techniques I've learned through their guidance to really decide, what are the techniques that really help create the images that I find most appealing. And those are ones that, aren't just, beautiful photos of a scene, but ones that really sort of engage the viewer and where you really feel a connection to. Those are the ones that jump out to me when I'm on Instagram or browsing the web. And, over the last many years, I've been learning sort of what are the things about those that appeal to me and that create that engagement. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in the slideshow tonight. So this talk is going to be about really about sort of compositional principles, but not the normal compositional rules like rule of thirds and golden ratio and the things that I think most photographers, are very familiar with. Those kinds of rules help you decide how to frame a scene. I'm going to talk about some principles, some of which may be familiar to you, others may not be. I know some of them are new to me in the last several years, and really helped me take my photography up a level. And these are principles that help you when you're in the field to identify and define what you're going to shoot, not just how you're going to shoot it. The goal for me when photographing landscapes, and this presentation, I am going to focus on landscape photography because wildlife photography and underwater photography are such different disciplines with just a totally different approach. But really with landscape photography, the goal is to draw your viewers into the scene and help them connect with it emotionally. So I'll talk about some of the principles that I keep in mind and that hopefully will help you if you want to achieve that effect. And then we'll talk a little bit about some post-processing principles that support that three-dimensional look that I'm going for. But this is not a post-processing seminar. I'm not going to put up Lightroom and Photoshop and teach techniques. That would be an entirely different presentation. So I like to think of when I'm out in the field of shooting, for three-dimensionality. And in doing that, I find it helpful that really there's sort of three general categories that almost every composition that I'm shooting needs to fit into one of these categories. Really because it's what helps you sort of identify what is the framing I want. Those categories are leading lines, layers, and framing. And if I see a scene that I really like, but it doesn't fit at least one of those, I generally look for, a different way to shoot it, or I might just pass on shooting it entirely. Obviously, pixels are free. I grew up in the film days, so I still have a little bit of that, reluctance to waste frames. But I really look for one of these kinds of categories of compositions because I find that really it helps enforce some discipline in what I'm shooting. So the first of these is leading lines, and that's something that I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with. It's a very common compositional tool, but it can take a lot of different forms. So this one is a very strong leading line composition, and this is taken actually with a drone from about a mile away from where we were standing. This is in the fjords of Chile and Patagonia, and we just flew our drones sort of up one of the fjords a long way, sort of towards the light, towards these mountain peaks, and found this amazing foreground. And really that foreground just grabs your eye and leads you into the distant peaks. This is a very different example, also from Alaska, also with a drone. And this one I like because of the different kinds of leading lines, right? Like obviously getting with a drone lets you get a very different perspective on the landscape. And I generally don't like to include sort of any man-made features in my photography. But I just found this scene really appealing. The contrast between the roads, which are very strong leading lines into the distance, but also sort of the old stream bed, which this is low tide in the Turnagain Arm, and so you get these really cool patterns in the with that stream leading into the distance, and it really takes your eye from the foreground into the inlet and to those distant mountains. And then last, this is a very different kind of leading line composition, but I still think it fits leading lines. And when I was framing it, that's what I was looking for, which was this foreground, the bottom left corner, where, by using a longer shutter speed and blurring the water, you get leading lines taking you into the main channel. This is Iguazu Falls, by the way, down in, I think this is on the Argentinian side. And But then what I really tried to do, and I'll talk about this more later, is highlight in post the leading line of the river channel that goes, off to the top left corner of the frame in the distance. And it's really that bottom left corner that takes your eye into it, and then, sort of you make that 90-degree turn, but it's all taking you inside into the falls and through the frame. The next category is layers. Again, this probably isn't new, but layers can, like leading lines, can take a lot of forms. Pretty classic layers composition here. Although this one is really, because there's so much haze shooting directly into the sun, and I'll talk about that some more later, the plant balancing the sun on the right side of the frame. But this is really just almost about form more than anything. It's really about the form of the mountains than the mountains themselves. But those receding layers just, create depth in the image. This is a different kind of layered composition, but one where just the rows of trees sort of create those layers and just draw your eye from the bottom of the frame, up through each succeeding layer. And you'll see there's, the sun rays through the mist, through the fog, also sort of act as a leading line, taking your eye, up through the frame. And so it works very much in concert with the layers. And then finally is framing, which is another technique that many of you are sure familiar with, but can look a lot of ways, right? In this case, it was really sort of using this foreground trees to frame. It was such thick fog, I couldn't even see the whole island behind. But this is, a lot of times what you can use as a frame is just not at all apparent. Sometimes it is, as the next image will show you, but a lot of times you have to look for and create your own frame. And in this case, I sort of walked down, the bank of the lake. This is a reservoir in Connecticut, and just had to find an opening that sort of worked with the subject, which was that island in the mist behind. So sometimes you have to work for your frame, but it gives you a lot of opportunity for creativity. There's another framing composition here where the frame, may not be quite what you think about in terms of having a frame in the foreground with a distant background, right? Here, the background is less important, and it's really about framing the great blue heron right there in the silhouette. But the important thing is that, the dark frame around the light in the middle and the background is what draws your eye, through the image, as opposed to it looking flat. And then here's a very different example of framing, but another one where, you've got to sort of work to find your frame. If you stood a foot to the right or a foot to the left here, you wouldn't really have a frame, but finding just the right spot through, the trees and the bushes to frame that mountain and its reflection in the lake. So, I'm generally trying to use at least one of those techniques, but definitely the most dynamic images are often when you can incorporate more than one of those categories into your image. And one way to think about that is to treat the categories as sort of elements of a scene as opposed to really categories, right? So that you're not, you don't feel like you're trying to fit one or the other, but rather recognize when there's a frame, recognize when there's leading lines, recognize when there's layers, or more than one, and then how do you include those elements in your scene in a thoughtful way? Because multiple elements definitely add complexity to a scene. You want to enhance the scene. So you've got to think about, how do I order those elements in a way that they're not competing with each other, but that they're working in harmony with each other. So, but these are some of my favorite kinds of images because of the challenge of composing them and getting everything to work in harmony. Um, so here, this is one example from Mexico where this this aloe plant, uh, just where it was positioned, you wouldn't necessarily. It was just kind of like an aloe plant in front of a rock. But when you and if I stepped back further and tried to just make this more of a full landscape scene, it wouldn't have had much impact. But by getting down tight inside the aloe, like those leaves act like leading lines pointing to that mountain in the distance. But they also frame the mountain, as do the hillsides in the midground, framing that mountain. So you've got leading lines, and a frame working together. Here's a different one from Caddo Lake. I know it's become a popular destination lately, and it's probably the only really great landscape photography in driving distance from Houston, or an easy driving distance from Houston. But here again, this is both framing, with the two sort of browner trees framing that, the more reddish cypress in the middle, but it's also layers, because you've got sort of foreground, midground, and then that taller tree further in the background. So it's both a layered composition and framing. This photograph is from Alaska, actually taken from a helicopter in Alaska. But here's one that's very much, it's a combination leading lines, right? Glaciers are awesome for leading lines because they almost always have those striations in them. And so you've got that leading line, the dark leading line, on the left, but also just the form of the glacier itself is a leading line that leads you up the valley. But then the mountains in the background, are their own layers and really help carry you back, through the frame. And you'll notice like a strong foreground here to help anchor it. And I'll talk about that concept a little bit later too. But this is one of my favorites from a recent trip to Alaska. Just such great atmosphere we had. And this is another Alaska photo. And this is, leading lines and framing again. Just sort of finding a gap, in the aspens, that can, and line up, the Matanuska River going deep into, the background and the mountain, and just combining that makes for a powerful composition. And you don't so much notice what's off on the right side, and there's more, but it really keeps your eye in the center and going through the frame. This one's from Mount Rainier, and this one is predominantly a framing composition. That's what the intent was when shooting it, but it became apparent that there were that those mountains created some layers in the background. It was kind of hard to see. This was a pretty thick brush, and I was actually holding my camera up high above my head and looking up I had to tilt down the screen on the back of the camera to be able to see what I was shooting. It was like, wow, there's some really cool layers back there in the background. And then the road that sort of winds around the mountains gives you a little bit of a leading line, but this is predominantly framing, and layers. But those two working together really give this image a lot of depth. So there's obviously like other types of compositions, and there's other very classic elements that add interest to a scene. But just, they don't really add three-dimensionality. So that doesn't mean they don't make for great photographs, because they definitely can. But if you're going for that three-dimensional look, just keep in mind, that's a different kind of image, right? So this one, very peaceful image that I really like a lot. In fact, I have this on my on my wall here in my office. But just a very simple reflection shot. It's about reflection and symmetry. Um, but it's pretty flat, right? It's pleasing, but it's a pretty flat image. It doesn't really draw you into it so much. There's a little bit of layering, but not really. This is mostly just about the reflection. Um, and 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 this one too. This one, this is a reflection shot. I think it has a little more depth because of the way the the lake sort of comes towards you, but it's not a real strong leading line. The layers are pretty limited, right? It's basically two layers. There's not really a frame. It's a very pretty scene, but it doesn't create as much depth as some of the others. Although, like if you'll notice the light behind the mountain, I'll talk about that in a little bit, how you can sort of use that to create a little more connection when the composition itself is lacking. You notice that it's really almost kind of blown out. Um, Pattern shots and abstract shots are another thing. I think everybody enjoys these a lot, and they can be really cool. But it's ultimately a flat image. It's not. It's one that you look at and you say, "Wow, that's really cool," but you don't really connect with it in the same way unless you're just someone who just really loves abstracts. These are braided rivers. It looks a lot like Iceland, but it's actually Alaska. This again, straight down aerial shot from a helicopter of a glacier, and it's got a little bit of three dimensionality to it because of the strong side lighting of the glacial um, ridges. But this is really sort of just a flat abstract. Um, and then finally, colors, which I think one trap that I used to fall into a lot, which is thinking that like colors, just beautiful colors or a beautiful sunset makes for a great image. And colors are pleasing. This one's another abstract. This is from the same location as the second leading line shot that I showed you, but from a drone top down. And the colors are really beautiful and the form is really cool. But again, it's still flat. This one from another Caddo Lake shot is one I really like, right? It's like amazing colors. We just had such great fall colors that year. And it's a neat pattern. It's beautiful colors, but it's a pretty flat shot. It's not one that like draws you into the scene and makes you just want to linger and want to be there. So the other thing, those three categories I would say are things that a lot of photographers have heard one or all of those before. Hopefully that helped give you a little bit of structure around them and how to use them. But one of the things that I've learned over recent years that is really, I think, captured my interest is the idea of transitions. And that they're really key to drawing the viewer into and through the scene. It helps for the image to be in those, have those different categories we just talked about, but it's these transitions that can, that really sort of make the magic happen. So there's three primary types. The first is big to small transitions. And so, here's a shot, this is a pretty iconic scene from McDonald Lake in Glacier National Park. And this is a little bit of a leading lines shot in that I've positioned, the rocks and, everyone does some sort of rock gardening there, but got sort of some pointy rocks sort of pointing back at the mountain in the background. But what really creates the depth in this scene is the big to small transition of those, large rocks in the foreground. They're not actually that large. They're kind of small pebbles, but using the natural distortion that a wide angle lens creates, sort of helps you create a big to small transition. And it's really that, the large foreground, like getting smaller as you go into the midground, that really draws your eye into the scene. This is another example of big to small transitions. And again, using that distortion of the wide angle lens. So I was, just inches from the ferns on the left, and from the water beneath. I actually had tripod sort of straddling this, it was on a rock. It was kind of like straddling this stream here, but really right down on top of things. And that big to small transition of those big ferns and the way the stream spreads out underneath, then obviously the stream creates a leading line to take you back, but it's that big to small transition that really draws your eye in. This is another example of that. Obviously leading lines, but also it's big to small. And what's interesting about this, so this shot is a 2-shot pano from my drone. And what's interesting about this one is that I'll just share a little story about it. So this was deep in the Patagonian fjords, and I was on a workshop with Mark Adamus, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. If not, you should definitely look him up. He's been very influential to me. One of the most influential landscape photographers working in the world today, and he leads expeditions to very remote places, in some cases that sort of no one else goes to. And this is one such location. No one else goes to the fjords, but he's been going there for 14 years and hadn't even been to this location because it's 10 kilometers up this river. And what you can't tell is that this river is about 6 inches deep the entire way. And there's a lot of rapids, below us, below where we're standing. And so he had to bring a jet boat down to the fjords. The first time anyone's ever had a jet boat down there. It's like a Zodiac with a modified outboard engine that can go in like 3 inches of water. And so he'd been seeing the outlets of this stream, this glacial river, for years and years, and wanted to get up there, but it's impassable, dense Coiway forest and southern beech forest. You can't walk through the stream because of the rapids, and you can't walk through the forest. So there's just no way to get up there, but he knew from topo maps that there was a mountain at the end. And so on our trip, we got to take the jet boat 10 kilometers up this stream. And I think we have a very high degree of confidence that no human has ever stood in this location before, because it is just so physically inaccessible. Plus there's no like indigenous people that live in this area. And it's just really uninhabited. So it's pretty cool because we were the first people ever to lay eyes on this scene. And we all shot it a little bit differently. But the way the 2-shot pano put this, I was able to put this together, really sort of helped create this big to small transition at the bottom of the frame, just because of the distortion of, the lens. And that's something, I know, a lot of people, including myself, don't like to play around with warping, in Photoshop and things like that. And there's a big movement like natural landscape photography, shoot it as it is. But, there's a lot of distortion that you can get from particularly from a wide angle lens. That's a lot of fun to play with, to really exaggerate forms. And that's part of what I do with these big to small transitions. Here's another example of that. Also a drone shot of Herman Fjord in Chile. And, just the way able to get, this incredible leading line, but it's the way that it spreads out at the bottom and gets narrower going back that really draws your eye back there. And notice too, the light, always shooting into the light, because that attracts your eye. I'll talk about that more later. So the next kind of transition, and I'll say the big to small transition is my favorite kind of shot. I just love that look. But there are other kinds. Dark to light transition is another common one. So this is an example. There's a little bit of a layered shot, but what really makes this shot is the dark, the dark bottom and the progressively lighter layers leading, that this is Dama Blanca, which is the tallest peak in the Sarmiento range, which is a sub-range of the Andes in Patagonia. And I think it's about a 6,000-foot peak that up until very recently had never been climbed before, just because this is some of the harshest environments in the world, the wettest non-tropical, I believe Mark says the wettest non-tropical place on Earth. And there's normally like 50-mile-an-hour winds and just crazy weather. There's actually documentaries about people trying to climb this and failing. But just the dark to light transition, and that, those clouds at the top, just pulling your eye up, into the mountain and beyond. Another example of dark to light, obviously from Caddo Lake here again, but just the light, I sort of emphasized the light, in the cypress more towards the back, and emphasizing the light through the center of the frame here to draw your eye back. This is a little bit of a framing composition as well. That's what I was sort of going for when I shot it, but it definitely needed that dark to light transition to the background. And then the last one is a transition of color. And just the change in color can be very powerful. This is a good example of that, right? This is both a leading lines shot with the road and obviously a layered shot with the mountains. But notice this shot doesn't really have a subject. And normally you always want to ask yourself, right? Like, what's the subject I'm shooting? There's no central mountain. There's no central tree. There's nothing that sort of is the focus. But what makes this shot is the combination of, the leading line and the layers, certainly, but it's that color transition of green to blue that really grabs your eye and makes this shot work. And then here's another example. Again, this has some big to small transition in it. But it's what I like about it is that color transition from sort of the beige sand to the stormy blue skies in the background. Also notice that, the white water is what really helps, so there's some dark to light transition here too, right? That really helps draw your eye into the frame and sort of keep it there. So just different ways, like it's learning about these transitions would really help make it click for me of, how do I, take a leading lines photo or a framing photo and sort of really make it engage with you. There are other ways to create depth in your images. And as I've mentioned a couple times already, one of the things that always helps with that is to include a foreground as well as a midground and a background. So having multiple layers, I don't mean layers in the sense of layered composition, but just different parts of your image that step through it. Images that don't have any foreground can still be beautiful images, but they tend to look flatter, right? Like this is an image taken, many of you have probably been there. This is Dallas Divide, taken from a very popular overlook between Ouray and Telluride in the San Juan Mountains. And it's an absolutely gorgeous scene. And there's some things you can do with it. I've shot it several different ways. Depending on what colors and patterns you get from the trees that year, you can maybe get some leading lines. There's a little bit of one here with the yellow trees in the middle, but fundamentally this is it's not really great layers in this shot. It's pretty. There's color, like I was saying before. It's appealing. The color in the sky is nice, but it's kind of a flat shot that doesn't really draw you into it and make you want to linger in it. It's the foreground that sort of adds dimension, and really the more prominent the foreground, the better in a lot of cases, right? Like here, this, you know, this was a, kind of a neat area on the Oregon coast, right? There's endless compositions on the Oregon coast, but it's really that powerful water in the foreground that really makes this image work. Sort of without that, without the energy from that, this would be a very unremarkable image. But I really like the way that foreground just sort of grabs your attention, and then you'll notice that the water, the light water kind of carrying you through the middle of the image so that you go all the way, back to that distant sea stack. Here's another example of including, a foreground in this, maybe a little less traditional, right? But this is also Iguazu Falls, and it's so easy when you're shooting, especially like a massive waterfall like Iguazu, where it's just so hard to get the entire thing in. So you look for different ways to shoot it that are really going to sort of engage as opposed to just being a distant look at a big waterfall. So here it was sort of get down, low, right on the banks and right up to the water. And so here, like obviously, I like a lot of people like to blur the water and waterfalls. In this case, it was I want to capture the power of it, and so I went with a faster shutter speed. But it's really that foreground that grabs your attention, and the background's really cool too because that's an enormous waterfall. But but it's the two that work together. Like without the foreground, this wouldn't be as cool of an image. Here's another example also from Iguazu, different cataracts, but really saw this blooming. I don't know what kind of flowers these are. I probably should have looked it up, but it's sort of focusing on just the big leaves and the big flowers, going for a little bit of big to small transition, but it's not really a transition shot so much because it doesn't really lead you back there. But it's having this foreground is just a different perspective on the waterfall. And those two cataracts aren't the most impressive ones by any means, but it's kind of a cool shot because those that powerful flowers in the foreground really grab you. And here I'll just for sake of comparison, right? This is Mount Rainier, reflection shot, obviously, and a very cool lenticular cloud that we got very lucky with, and a beautiful image, but relatively flat. And again, by flat, I don't mean bad. It's just it's not one that like draws you in and keeps you there and like leads you through the frame, really, right? Whereas shooting it differently, as a vertical, and with these leaves, so giving you big to small transition, and a powerful foreground, leading you then towards then the reflection sort of helps bring you into the scene and then up to that lenticular cloud in the background. And this image just has, in my opinion, sort of more depth, makes you linger on it longer than this image. Even they're both beautiful, but and some people may like the first one better, but I really like the interest that the foreground adds, and the transition. So one thing that I try to keep in mind with foregrounds is that the background with landscape photography, usually it's the background that you're focused on, right? Like the big mountains, the big scene behind you. And the foreground is sort of how you anchor the composition, and that's like how you create that three-dimensionality. The nice thing is that like foregrounds are a lot easier to find than backgrounds, particularly because you can use that distortion from a wide angle lens, to make little things look much bigger. So start with your background, and then you can usually find a foreground, and it really can transform the image. So like in this case, this was like a covered bridge shot that I took, many years ago, in Connecticut before I was really, had learned these principles, and it's okay. Nice scene doesn't really do anything for me anymore. and I think this is a slightly different bridge. I couldn't find my shots of the same bridge, but it's a very similar shot, but one with where I went out, okay, I like a covered bridge. Let me find one with a foreground. Let me find a foreground for it. So I climbed down into the water with these rocks and deliberately found some rocks that had a little bit of a leading line uh, to them, like this one on the left kind of angling back towards the scene and the ones on the right pointing in the other direction, not unlike the rocks in the McDonald Lake or McDonald Lake shot that I showed earlier. And those rocks create a leading line and they create a sort of a big to small transition. And that sort of takes you into the frame to where it's not just about the covered bridge, but it's really about like you linger in the whole scene. And I think that this is a much stronger composition than just something like this, which is a little bit flat and kind of lacks some interest. Here's another example of just find like you can find a foreground. This was actually on the grounds of the hotel we were staying at in Mendoza, Argentina, just in January. And I was just sitting out with the family. We were sitting on some chaise lounges, enjoying some pisco sours and this incredible sky where it was like mostly overcast, but then this slit opens up in the sky and the sun rays just, streaming through it. And I'm like, that is so cool. But like just shooting, a picture of the sky, even with cool sun rays is sort of boring. Like I wouldn't do anything with that. So, what can I do to anchor that composition? And there were these plants. These plants are actually called red hot pokers, believe it or not, which I guess is appropriate. But found this plant. I'm like, that could be really cool. Just that'll give me a foreground. And I was very deliberate about lining it up with those. I think they're called American Century plants behind to give a little bit of mid-ground element as well. And then that that really cool those God beams coming out from before, like that gives you foreground, mid-ground, background, and really lets that light draw your eye through the frame. But you've got that interest in the foreground that really anchors the whole composition. Whereas if I didn't have these flowers in it, it would just be sort of a boring picture of a cool sunset on the lawn. So, again, other ways to create depth. I always used to worry about shooting into the light, right? And it was always, oh, you want to be, you don't necessarily want to be backlit, but you want to be side lit because side lighting, enhances shadows and creates contour. And that's true. And side light can be great, but shooting straight into the sun is, that was something I was always, taught not to do. Although, ironically, underwater, I always shoot directly into the sun. You've got the water column to block it, and you get these sun balls that can be a great secondary subject. But on land, you usually think, oh, I'm going to get flare, I'm going to blow out highlights. But in reality, you should shoot towards the light as much as you can. Part of that is, and this is actually a principle I saw if any of you watched like Simone de Montron, I think is his name, a popular YouTube photographer. He actually just did a video that I saw last week talking about some similar ideas. And he said luminance attracts the eye more than chrominance, which is very true, right? Like color's really cool, but it's light that attracts your eye. And so include as much light as you can in your image. And, a similar brightness between the foreground and the background, like that, again, like think back to that first Mount Rainier shot, creates a bit of a flat image because you don't really have this difference in light. If you shoot into the light, you can create a path for your eye to follow through the frame. So here's an example of that from Dream Lake in Rocky Mountain National Park. We were there and didn't really get, the sun in this spot doesn't really line up. I was hoping to get like a sun star through the mountains, but that's just like not the way the planets aligned there. But there was, I had the sun back there in the frame, and then this is another example of like find a foreground, right? Because just shooting that notch in the back wouldn't be such an exciting composition, but by getting right down on top of the ice, you got these little methane bubbles, which kind of create a cool foreground. You've got some leading lines from the cracks in the ice. But what really makes this is that light path as the light spills over the ripples in the frozen lake, and that color matches the color in the sky, and that's really what makes this shot work. You'll notice too, there's a color transition here, right? You've got strong blues leading up to the pinkish peach sky. So there's a lot of things in this image working together. And out in the field, thinking about these things, I was very intentional about how I composed this shot in order to combine all those elements, because otherwise it was going to be kind of a boring shot. And here's another example, right, of shooting into the light and creating a path of light, that takes your eye from the foreground into the background with that strong, bright tree illuminated in the background. This is especially important when you're shooting in a forest. Forest photography is really, really challenging because there's usually so much going on. It's so complicated that a lot of times it's just a jumble of leaves, and there's no identifiable subject. Your eye doesn't know where to go. So one really important principle in shooting in a forest is shoot towards the light. One tip that Mark Adamus gives in that regard is like, go stand in the darkest part of the forest and look out towards the light, and that's where you should be shooting. Think of that, the sun as essentially as your background, and then find a foreground that works that way. So here's one example of that, right? Like in this forest, this really cool tree. Now this is also, this was a complicated shot to line up. I don't usually use tripods anymore, just because it's so hard to get into some of the locations where you really need to get to. And when you're doing these close tiny foregrounds and exaggerating them, you've got to be within inches from them. And so just dealing with a tripod and making the minor adjustments is sort of impossible. But here, just had to be very careful to line stuff up to get a sun star between the branches, get the branches as leading lines, and the ferns, balancing the composition. But then the light leading, particularly in post, and I talked about this, like really sort of brightening those ferns that go back towards the background. And that sun star sort of, is what, like, if that sun star wasn't there to like be that focal point, this composition wouldn't work nearly as well. It would sort of lack any oomph. Here's another example. This is one of my favorite shots from the redwoods in the Oregon coast. But this is a really good example of like how to shoot in a complicated environment. There's so much going on, and it was really like, okay, simplify. In that case, isolate. So I just really isolated this one branch of the rhododendron that was sticking up above the rest. Unfortunately, it had a couple blooms on it, but you can see like how bright it is back there, even aside from the sun star, right? Like it's bright back there in the background, and it was dark where we were. And so letting that light spill through the frame, when you look at the bottom of the rhododendron actually does a little bit of framing as well too, as do the trees. So there's framing going on here. There's a rhododendron as a leading line. And then you've got that bright light in the background that really draws your eye. And you don't notice like all of the clutter in the forest because you're focused on, that path through the frame. And then lastly, I think I mentioned this earlier, but, one of the other things that that I think we all fret about so much in landscape photography is control the highlights. Like, don't blow out your highlights. And, definitely that's particularly important, like in wildlife photography, right? But it's okay to blow out highlights in landscape photography. It adds like dynamism and power and emotion to the frame. and sometimes I'll shoot something, uh, I'll shoot it in a way where I'm not blowing out too much of the highlights, but then in post, I will blow them out intentionally. So here's an example, like in an ice cave in Alaska. Again, strong leading lines shot, obviously. Um, Lots, strong big to small transition, but it would be boring if there was flat light here. So we shot straight out the cave at this, and it was a very bright day out there, and you can see like just how blown out that middle is. Now we had someone like standing in the entrance, right, to give you a little bit of a focal point, even though they're really small. But if I had controlled for the highlights here and made sure that like that right side of my histogram was inside, um, it would have uh, this image wouldn't have worked. It's the it's the dynamism of that blown out highlights in the back that really makes it. Um, Here's another example. Uh, the this scene is just so moody, right? But and it's got a lot of elements in it that make it work, like a foreground with that bush in the right that kind of helps anchor things. You got a midground. You've got layers in the background, misty layers. You've got leading lines with those with the rivers that lead through and to the rear of the back of the frame. But what makes this image is that blown out sun in the top left of the frame and all the light spilling around it. And if you think about it, right, like if you're looking at it with your eye, it's probably blown out too. And so it also helps make it more real, but it enables you to get away with a lot more shadow depth because you've got this incredible dynamic range. And so that's just something to just be mindful of, is that sometimes you need to blow out the highlights, and that's really what makes the image. Uh, so as I mentioned earlier, wildlife photography is also something I love, particularly birds. I don't get a chance to shoot other wildlife as much as I would like to, but went to Africa a couple of years ago, and so here's an example, right? Like in wildlife photography, the way you engage your viewer with wildlife photography is the animal looking right at you. Like this image just grabs you because you're looking into the eyes of a lion, um, and uh, and it's just transfixed, right? Um, and but now here, these giraffes sort of looking at you. Um, not, I mean, it helps. Like they attract your eye, whatever. But like what I should have done with this scene was recompose it a little bit more to the left and um, and focus more on the landscape and the giraffes in the landscape as opposed to the giraffes themselves. Um, the so it's when you're shooting a landscape, the animal looking into the landscape takes the viewer's gaze into the landscape, whereas if there are animals looking at you like you're trying to go for in wildlife photography, it sort of takes you out of the landscape and all the focus is on the animal. So in this case, down in Patagonia, like this Wanako looking off into the distance, into Cerro Torre, like that is what draws your eye into that Mordor looking, craggy mountains, and those, there are layers, and you can see, the path of the light, the strong light in the background to attract your eye. But what really makes it, is the Wanako and the way he's looking back there, like he's taking in the scene. Another example of that, right? Like the bear, you know, looking through the scene, um, makes it more of a landscape image. Whereas like if the bear was looking at me, all of your focus would go to the bear and you wouldn't really notice the mountains behind. In this case, and this isn't, the shot did not turn out the way I wanted for two reasons. One, the goat wasn't quite looking back. He was more looking to the side. And also I somehow managed to knock my camera, I have no idea how I did it, into JPEG mode. And so I only have a JPEG of this shot. So I was kind of pretty mad at myself, but I put it in here because it's an example of like that, like just this composition alone wouldn't really be that interesting of a composition. And if I had the mountain goat standing there and looking at me, you wouldn't even really notice the background so much, but him looking into the scene really takes your eye into the scene. Here again, this is, I didn't get as much of the background of the ocean in here, but the penguin looking away and back towards where he came from, like would draw your eye back there. So finally, just a few comments on some post-processing principles, some of which I've touched on already. But when you're post-processing, images where you're trying to create that three-dimensionality, you have to think about like, how do things really look, your eyes in the real world, especially because we have so many tools available to us in Lightroom and Photoshop, where you can really, you can really sharpen things up and really define things well. And, earlier on in my photographic journey, I was kind of drawn into doing some of that. And so here's an example of that. Like this is Crystal Lake in outside of Ouray, Colorado. Actually the same lake where that reflection shot that very symmetrical reflection shot was taken. But when I post-processed this, I didn't really focus on this really great mist in the foreground. I was like, oh, the mountains are the thing. I need to sharpen up those mountains. And, so I applied some clarity to it. I don't remember if I did any like AI sharpening to this. It was probably before there was Topaz or anything, but I definitely sharpened up the mountains and like made it clear. And all I did in achieving that was just flattening the shot. Obviously there's not a really good sky here either. But this was like, I kind of liked it, but I didn't know what I liked about it. In retrospect, there's this really cool atmosphere in the front. And if I processed this correctly, I could have really emphasized the layers that are here. But instead, I didn't emphasize the layers. I sharpened everything up in the background and just lost the sense of depth. I was just, the wrong approach to processing that one, right? That atmosphere in the foreground, like that adds hate, and really any atmosphere. And even, it's great when you get cool fog and everything. But any amount of atmospheric haze reduces sharpness and it reduces black levels. And that increases the further away you go into the background, right? So here's a very good example of that. A foggy morning at Caddo. And the closest tree is a little bit darker. And then that, as the trees get more distant, the black levels get lighter and the sharpness gets lower. And so, so that furthest tree in the back is just sort of a hint of the tree back there. It's that progression of sharpness, to haziness that creates the three-dimensionality in the image. So here's an example. So this is from the same location as that mountain goat shot I just showed. This is, many of you may have been here, this, Bear Hat Mountain in Glacier National Park. But you can see here, particularly on the right side, right, those mountains on the right that recede into the distance, they get a little lighter, less black, lighter gray, more hazy further they go back. And that's really what gives this image some three-dimensionality to it. Particularly because from this platform where we were standing, I couldn't really get a foreground, a strong foreground into it. So it really needed those layers to create some three-dimensionality. And it kind of helped. This is obviously a pano. And so panos obviously, create distortion around the edges. And so it helped distort the clouds a little bit to where they almost act as leading lines a little bit too. But it's those hazy layers that a small part of the shot, but that's the part of the shot that I like the best. So if you have that atmosphere, embrace it, emphasize it. Again, in this example, like this, the atmosphere just makes this shot. You get, it's a little bit, it's not really a framing shot so much, but and it's not really, there's not really great layers in it, but it's like that atmosphere like creates the depth. Here's one of my most popular shots and one of my personal favorites from Mount Fitzroy, and just really cool atmosphere that we got, that kind of blew through as this Wanako just stood up there and posed for us. And he is looking directly at us, but because he's far enough away, you can't really tell that. So it doesn't take your eye, out of the scene. But what takes your eye into the scene is that mist, and particularly like if you're looking at this, I bet your eye is going to that right side of the image, right? Because that's where the bright light is. And there again, I sort of blew out the highlights there to maximize the dynamism of the image. Really sort of emphasized all that cool mist and haze between the layers of the mountain, and that's what creates the three-dimensionality. Also notice that the foreground is definitely darker, lighter where the Wanako is standing to draw your eye there, and then your eye jumps back to those mountains. Just a really cool experience being there. Other things you can do, right? Like, I always, with every image as I'm processing it, you're shaping the light with dodging and burning, or radial and linear filters, whatever tools you like to use. But you don't just have to, just do global sliders and let the sliders control, right? Like, you shape that light, with the tools available to you to really emphasize what you want to emphasize. And the helpful way to think of it is to let the type of composition guide your creative decisions as you're processing. So if you're processing a leading lines shot, well, that shot is about those leading lines. So how do you emphasize those, right? In this case, like this is a drone shot from the Chilean fjords again, strong leading line, obviously, leading towards that lake. And, I really, as that river gets further away, it gets brighter. And it makes sense because I'm shooting into the light. Obviously, there was pretty heavy overcast here, although we had these awesome asparagus clouds that look like you're standing underneath an upside down tub of Cool Whip. But it's that light behind the mountain that makes it natural that there would be more light in the background than the foreground. But I had to sort of darken the foreground a little bit and brighten that leading line to really emphasize that. And that's what draws your eye through the frame. Here's another like more complex example. But this one's got obviously a lot of leading lines, but really brightening up the braided river, and that strong bright light in the background. And those of you who've been paying attention may realize that, oh, hey, it was it was a closer up version of this scene that I showed earlier of an image taken with just that green ridge that's in the middle towards those receding mountains in the background, um, that I really like. But this is obviously from much further back. We're in a helicopter here, but it was really important to really emphasize the braided river particularly as it goes back behind that central island on each side of it. That's what draws your eye back to that background. If I hadn't done that, this would just kind of look like a big, flat foreground, with a dark ridge in the middle and, a bright sky. When you're processing a layers shot, um, separate the layers. This is a little bit more of a little bit more challenging technique. It can take a lot of time to really do it right. Um, but but particularly when you don't have a lot of atmospheric haze, layers can actually look very flat. And so in post, it's important to try to separate those so that the viewer can see that, yes, there are layers. So here, if you look at the background of this shot, like that first row of rocks, right? See that little mist above it? That's sort of emphasized. I emphasized that in post by brightening that up behind that rock, because otherwise it just looked like the first row of rocks and the darker row behind were just sort of one flat slab. But by separating those layers, with a little bit of dehaze, a little bit of brightness applied very carefully, very meticulously along the contour, it's able to define the layers, and that gives it a little more depth. I did it on, and you got to do it between each layer too. So if you pay close attention, you'll see that in each of those layers. There's another example from Torres del Paine. And, here again, like this, I love the shot because it's a very layered shot. Notice there is a leading line on the left side that helps draw your eye through it. Because this is a wider ratio, it's not a pano, but I cropped it just because of the scene. I didn't need a lot of the empty sky above. And in doing that, it creates, a wider image, which means you've got to have interest. One of the other things is sort of a just more general compositional tool is like, however you divide up your image, like if you think rule of thirds, that creates 9, zones in your image. Or you may just divide it, 3 and 3.5 and have 6. But however you think about it, you want something of interest in every part of the image. If you have just a big empty spot in your image, it's like it almost is like a vacuum that like sucks the eye in there. So like I was very intentional about including that stream on the left. So I had to stand exactly where I could see it over the ridge, but I wasn't cutting off the beech tree on the right. But what really makes this image and gives it the depth is the way I just very subtly separated the layers between each of these ridges. Because that really helps you see that these are different separate mountains stepping all the way into the horizon. And then last, with framing compositions, right? Emphasize that frame. So a lot of times I'll use vignette, mostly like a manual vignette. So rather than just an automatic one, but just depends on the image. But you want to sort of darken the areas around the frame, remove distractions around the edge and really focus on the frame itself. And so this image is an example of that. And this, this was it was a really cool tree. It's called a Cowan tree. It's like these massive bonsai trees that live in the Patagonian fjords. And this Cowan forest with this really cool tree on top. But the background was like a pretty big just jumble of other Coways. And so it was really in post where I created the frame by uh, brightening up these are actually branches from several different trees, right? But it looks like one arcing frame above the central tree. You don't notice that it's like a jumble of them because sort of emphasize that in post to draw, to just sort of use the light to create the frame. And then obviously, a lot of light on that central tree. And dark behind. That really is what sort of makes this three-dimensional when it was otherwise a very flat shot. So anyway, I think that's all I've got for you. So I was afraid this might go long, but just a little
I
bit
did
over
not.
an hour.
I did
Uh,
not mind, Ben.
what's that?
I did not mind at all.
I hope not. So you didn't
No.
interrupt me at all, so I was worried. I'm like, am I online? Anyone hear me?
No, no, no. No, no, no. I've got some questions for you. So let
Okay.
me finish let you finish whatever you were going to say or
Yeah, no,
share
that's
your
it. I just have to figure out how I
stop sharing. Yeah.
stop sharing.
There you
There we
go.
go.
Yeah, you're good. Okay. So just a couple of questions in here, but I've been sitting on them. Okay, this is a photo. It was the aloe, and I think you had one with ferns in the back in the foreground. Valerie was curious if you were focus stacking any of those images.
Yes, that one was focus stacked. Yeah. And sometimes if you're doing that sort of close focus, wide angle, um, you do need to focus stack. Although I will say that like it can be hard to focus stack those sometimes because like sometimes you're having to handhold that and not do it on a tripod.
Right.
And so um, it can be a challenge. A really wide angle lens like helps you avoid the need to do that. I don't like focus stacking too much because it's just a pain in the butt to like figure out which images in my roll and then to go through that whole process to create it. But sometimes that's the only way to get the scene.
Okay. Mika's question for you was she wants to know, are these techniques sort of your muscle memory for you now when you frame your shots and then enhance them with your post processing?
I wouldn't say muscle memory. Like I have to think about it very intentionally when I'm out there. But the reason, really, sort of the genesis of this presentation was that I'd sort of condensed from like all the information I've learned on Mark Adams's workshops and Chris Burns and Gary Randall and lots of other people that I've done workshops with. Take a little bit from everyone. Definitely a lot of influence. If any of you are familiar with Mark Adams's work, he's been very influential to me, and that probably shows up in some of my work. But um, you know, like it's muscle memory for him. He's a savant, and like if you see him work in the field, it's like, oh my god. But for the mere mortals among us, like for myself, and particularly because I don't, I'm a I'm a working attorney in Houston. Like I don't get to go out doing landscape photography very often, so I have to sort of shake off the rust when I'm out there. And really, like I said, the genesis of this presentation was like boiling those concepts down into simple principles that I can keep in mind when I'm in the field. It's easy to remember. Okay, leading lines, layers, or framing, um, transition, and find a foreground, and just those things are really easy to remember in the field, and then you just sort of take your time and find it. And I think that hopefully can help be a helpful way for people to remember this.
Okay. Speaking of wide angle, do you have a favorite wide angle lens?
um Not really. I shoot Nikon. I've got the Z system, and so um I have their uh 14 to 24. But it's like actually a little like 14 is wide, but it's not as wide as what I'd really like to get some of
Mm.
those really exaggerated foregrounds and things. And so I actually bought Laowa came out with a 10 millimeter lens for the Z system, which is only like, I think it's only like $600 or something, which, is, you know, not an insignificant amount of money, but compared to some of these lenses, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
And I've used it a handful of times. I'm trying to think if any of the photos in this presentation were with that. I've definitely got one from Patagonia that's really cool. But I guess what I would say is the wider the better. Because one of the things about with a really wide angle lens, right, is that it does make your backgrounds get really small. And so it kind of forces you to find a foreground. Otherwise, everything's gonna look like you were just really far away from whatever it was. And so I kind of like that about it, that like it makes me find a foreground. It makes me shoot for three dimensionality. So the lens itself, I mean, it's not the sharpest lens in the world. Like the Z lenses are definitely sharper, but I think like Sony, like there's a 12 millimeter lens that Sony makes that's really good, whatever. But yeah, I would just say like the wider the better. You can't always use it, but it really opens up a lot of creativity.
Okay. So Andy, he said, did anyone ask if he does a lot of exposure bracketing? No, Andy, no one did. So I'm asking, do you do a lot of exposure
Not
bracketing?
really. And a couple of reasons for that. One, um, cameras and sensors have gotten so good lately that you can really pull a lot of detail out of shadows, and you don't really get that much noise anymore. Um, but two is that like I don't mind blowing out my highlights. You don't want to blow out the whole sky, right? That's a mistake. But um, I also have learned to get over like looking at the histogram on my camera, and if a little bit of it is, if it looks like it's off a little bit, then like, oh no, I've got to crank down the aperture. Particularly like if it's a bright day, and you're already at base ISO. Your options are, do I want to get out a neutral density filter and mess with that, or what? So I mean, sometimes you can't avoid doing that. You have to. Um, but what I've learned is like, don't be afraid. Like the sun should be blown out. Like when was the last time you were able to look at the sun and see any detail, right? I mean, so even when it's behind the clouds, like it should be blown. So you just want to be thoughtful. Look at your blinkies to see what's blowing out, but even that's not totally accurate because of the way the JPEGs convert stuff. So I will exposure bracket on occasion, and if there's something's got really a ton of dynamic range, I might shoot two exposures, like one just to control for highlights, and then one, for shadows, and I might blend them. But I don't like exposure blending. Again, that really technical stuff like exposure blending and focus stacking, I'll I'll do it if I need to, but I prefer to avoid it. And in fact, one thing I'll say is that um, I don't use layers in Photoshop. I do a lot of my post processing in Photoshop, especially when I'm really going for depth. Um, and I, but I am mostly when I'm in Photoshop, I'm just using Camera Raw, and I'm not using the filters in Camera Raw, like the radial filters and the linear filters that much. I use a system I learned from Mark, which is like uses, and I won't try to teach it here because it's complicated, but it just uses the history brush to sort of I make an edit in to the whole, make global edits in Camera Raw, and then um, step back in the history, and then use the history brush to just paint those edits onto the part of the image where I want them. So when I'm making the edit in global edit in Camera Raw, like only the part of the scene that I'm working on is going to look good. The rest of it's going to look like total crap. But then I only paint it on to the image where I want that edit. And I have found like layers are complicated, and it's just, I don't even fully, I get them in principle, but all the details of how they work and layer mask and all this kind of stuff can be hard. Like this approach really makes it much more artistic because all I'm using is a brush, and just a brush with different opacity and different feathering and different size, and just you're just painting your adjustments on where you want them. And I find that to be a very easy way to sort of manage the dynamic range without having to do a lot of exposure bracketing.
Okay. All right, Ben. I think I covered all the questions in here. There was, well, it was a question mark, but I'm not sure that it was really a question. But you mentioned the Mariposa flower. Is that right? Do you recall that? Mariposa. Um, yeah. So Wanda just said, she said Mariposa flower. We have those here in Texas. So I'm not
Oh, it might
sure.
be. It might be. I said I didn't know the name of the flower.
Oh,
Um,
oh, oh,
in the
okay.
in front of
That's what
Iguazu
it was.
Falls, those white ones.
Those white flowers.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So maybe that's what she's doing. Thank you. Thanks, Wanda. All right. I'm gonna say just that. God, there's some beautiful places in this world, and
yeah,
you've
there
gotten a
really
chance
are,
to see a lot of them.
and that's one of the
Um,
reasons I've been so like gotten so into the focusing on the landscape stuff recently is because I mean I love wildlife and I love to go see it, but like shooting places like Patagonia and Alaska like just makes you
sure.
get out and see the world, you know.
Yeah. 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 So where are you going next? What's on the
So
bucket
next
list?
I'm going back to my roots in at the end of May and doing a little family trip to go scuba diving in Fiji. Uh,
Okay.
I haven't gotten to do as much diving. Been getting back into it lately, and I've got a new house, underwater housing and set up and all that.
Yeah.
But Fiji, I've always wanted to go there because it's the soft coral capital of the world. It's one of the most colorful places in the world. So I'm excited
Okay.
for that. That's in late May, so probably by August, stuff will start showing up on my Instagram feed.
That's
Um,
okay. That's okay.
and then the wife and I are
Um,
going to be spending the summer at some Airbnbs in Colorado. So I'm starting off at the Crested Butte Wildflower Festival. Um, yeah, because most of the time I've been in the mountains has been in the fall, and I haven't done as much like in the spring with the wildflowers.
yeah.
So I'm excited. I'm excited for that.
Yes, some of the photos that came through, you were showing, it was the fall, the colors that just really caught my attention. But I added to my little list is I got to see one of those braided rivers in person. I just have to do that. That's one of those things I've never seen. I've never been anywhere that would have one that I know of. So
Well,
several of your photos.
I hope you like
Great.
helicopters or you have a drone, one of the two, because that's how you.
Well, I'm cool with the helicopter,
All right,
so
good. Yeah,
got to
that's
do that. Yeah,
a cool way to shoot.
that's beautiful. Okay, so I'm gonna sneak in. Shirley snuck in real quick. The reservoir in Connecticut. She's curious. Was that in Mystic Groton? Is that
No,
no? Okay. Okay.
it was. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's blank. I'm blank. It's near. Gosh, it's northwest Connecticut, and I want
Okay.
to say Barnstable, but that's Massachusetts. Forgetting. It's a really. It's. I'm sorry.
That's cool.
I'll try and think
That's
of it. But
fine.
yeah, it's a really cool
That's
reservoir.
for
There's like a sort of pilot house or something that's like uh
Barkhamsted. Barkhamsted.
Barkhamsted. Yes, that's it. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, that's
Barkhamsted
what she
Reservoir.
that
There you
that
go.
that was her guess. All right.
Um,
Yay.
and there's
So
a really
yeah.
cool like medieval looks like a medieval turret that's like the pump house. It's out in the middle and there's a stone bridge out to it. It literally looks like something um from Game of Thrones or something. But it's an awesome shot because it's like this great leading line shot out to this cool looking thing. I have some images of that. I didn't put them in the presentation, but you get like there in the fall, like you get like really cool, like a lot of mist and atmosphere.
All right. Well, that just leaves room for maybe another presentation at some point down the road. All right, Ben, thank you for sharing your photos and some of these marvelous tips. And I hope, I think based on the chat, I think a lot of people really enjoyed your presentation and your
Hope
photos,
so.
which I knew they would. So I like to say again, Linda's always right. All right, well, next week, Joey Hamner will be here with his presentation, Seen like a Wildlife Photographer Before You Lift the Camera. So, y'all have a nice night, and we'll see you next week.